that were shipped to Syria. This while the American stealth jets intercepted a pair of Russian fighters operating in an area that was off limit to Russian jets over the country. We've got a lot of things going on still militarily, so we brought in retired U.S. Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Dakota Wood, who is currently a research fellow for Heritage Foundation, along with Rebecca Grant, former Secretary of the Air Force official and currently Irish Independent Research president. I want to go to you first, Dakota, because Heritage Foundation put out this wonderful report, not necessarily the contents of it, but the report in and of itself about military preparedness. Just as we're finding out, ISIS a lot more sophisticated than we thought, and Russia perhaps preparing for a war that we're not preparing for.
Yeah, our index of U.S. military strength actually brought a copy, but it's a report card on the status of the military, and we found that it's only about 2/3 the size that historically it's needed to be. Only about 1/3 of that force that we have is actually ready. That's per testimony from various service officials. It's aging in terms of a lot of the equipment that was introduced in the 1980s and 90s, and we haven't kept pace with modernizing that stuff. So the men and women in uniform are doing extraordinary things, under-resourced and without adequate time to train. We have a small force, and you're constantly operationally deployed. You know, when do you find to educate and train and make sure you have a full set of skills? So we capture that in our index, and it's been well received, although, as you'd said, the story is kind of a sad one.
Rebecca, of course, ISIS is on the run, but as we start to learn how sophisticated they were, it might explain why they were able to capture so much territory in such a small period of time and hold on to it for so long. And it might also be a cautionary warning as we may one day have to go against even more advanced adversaries.
ISIS has long been scooping up weapons. They stole a lot of equipment from the Iraqi army. Of course, now Iraq has pushed them out of their territory completely. But you're right, Charles, we have to watch for that. With their virtual caliphate, they still want to wreak mayhem as much as possible. And they'll be looking to get into that illicit arms trade for those, particularly those small weapons, RPGs, communications devices. We saw Egypt in the Sinai broke up a nest of ISIS and found all kinds of bad stuff. So we really have to try to interdict that arms trade and prevent ISIS from reaching that level of power again.
Dakota, the $700 billion President Trump was able to garner for the Department of Defense, many are saying that's a good start, but it's still too little, and it could be too late if we can't continue to get that kind of money out of Washington, D.C. But this serious opposition against any more serious funding for the military.
Yeah, it's been very iterative, and continuing resolutions to CR mean no new start on programs. You can't do any multi-year purchases where you get the best deal for the American taxpayer. So stability of funding is absolutely essential. And the $700 billion that's been proposed is still limited by the Budget Control Act at about $583 or something like that. So they still have a second step in order to getting some kind of a bipartisan agreement to raise the ceiling on the Budget Control Act. But it's a first step, and will take a decade or more to dig out of the hole that the military is currently in.
Quickly, Rebecca, China's still militarizing those man-made islands. Russia with their own, ideas on the world. Where are we going?
China is not a near peer, it's a peer, it's a real threat. One of those islands has hardened aircraft shelters, petroleum, fiber optics. It's a ready-to-go air base. And what we're seeing in Syria and up in Japan as well, it's what we saw with the F-22s.
So the bottom line, though, is we shouldn't underestimate China. They're not in our rear-view mirror.